And welcome back. So this will be part two of my discussing The Fighting Man of Japan from F.J. Norman. And if you haven't seen part one, you should go watch that because I give a lot of context as to what the heck I'm about to talk about. Now, in the in-between, I did actually go and measure my bokken to see what length it was compared to his preferred shinai, and mine is clocking in at 29-inch blade and then just under 10-inch handle. So I wonder what his comparison if he handled mine would be. Though it is a note that he's using a shinai, not a bokken. They probably used a bokken here and there, but the preference wouldn't be that different, I don't think. But either way. Now, from there he goes to talk about what the actual school is like in regards to its general, how everyone conducts themselves in it, and it actually sounds a lot like most HEMA schools I've been in. Just kind of long room. People kind of set their gear off to the side. This is also their hangout area / spectators, and they'll just have a bout. They'll pick a spot, fight, and then move on. And he does make the reference that specifically in regards to them fighting, they don't need a ton of room. Which, if you look at footage of any kendo school, they are packed. Heck, if you look at footage of judo as well, in Japan, they are packed. The floor is completely packed all the time. And considering how they fight, they don't need a ton of room to execute their techniques. And there's certainly something to be said for learning to fight in a very small space, which I can greatly appreciate. I believe it was Sugar Ray Leonard who was quoted as he'd learned how to fight in a phone box. And if you can apply that methodology as a thing that you can use and cultivate, it can come in handy when you're a tall guy in a small ring or something along those lines. But anyway, next he moves into the bit that's super intriguing, which is where he specifically goes over some differences between Western and Japanese style of fighting, which is to go into details over all the cuts, guards, and points a Japanese fencer's repertoire is not the object of this article. But it is well to point out here that during the 15 years experience of Kenjutsu, I remember seeing only one man make use of a real backhanded stroke, and he, though one of the best swordsmen in Japan, took the idea I fancy from seeing me use it. Now, by backhanded, I believe he's talking about a false edge attack. I don't necessarily know that for sure. The other alternative could be he's doing something more along the lines of this, though certainly they already strike from that side, but the mechanics are slightly different, so it could be somewhat like that, but I imagine it's probably a false edge strike, or something along those lines. Another remarkable point about the Japanese system of swordsmanship is that it has over never delivering that it has is never delivering a point except at the throat. But this perhaps is to be explained by the fact that until the 70s, armor was largely used by them. This point even is more of a jab than a lunging thrust, and is delivered from below upwards at the very evident object of getting in between the gorget and the upper part of the breastplate. Now, this is very similar to some thrusts that you will learn if you were to practice any longsword system, really. You have plunging thrusts, or then your kind of goring thrusts that come up and through. And certainly when you do some armor, you learn a lot. But not surprising that is a go-to thrust that just kind of sticks around. And certainly I've seen footage of Kendo practitioners still using this thrust because that's the only place they're allowed to hit. It's significant. It's a damn solid thrust. But anyway. Da-da-da. Although highly scientific, Kenjutsu is a very rough and tumble sort of swordplay, absolutely free from parade and all theoretical touches. Theatrical, rather, not theoretical. But wonderfully practical withal. A Japanese chivalry is uncompromisingly based on the idea that all's fair in love and war. So, an important thing there, and it's still continuing, I'll kind of abbreviate because I don't want to read too much here when you could read it yourself, not in my voice, is basically that if there is any perceived advantage, be it your opponent slips, your opponent loses their sword even, which he specifically references, your opponent falls over, you dive on them immediately. And that's the norm. And to a certain extent that exists in modern HEMA somewhat, continuous fighting rules, things along those lines. But for the most part, we do still adhere to the idea of my opponent has fallen or something along those lines where they're unable to continue, they'll let it go. Whereas here, the culture is encouraged to take that extra hit. And you still see that in modern Kendo, from what I could gather. I watched a couple videos of it, and one of the biggest things I noticed is that one would get underneath the other's elbows, shove him over, and as soon as he landed, he dived on him with a hit. If he got back up, he hit him again. And if he threw him over again, he hit him again. I saw one video, guy threw the dude, went for a hit, he blocked. As he tries to stand up, he throws him again, hits him again. It's just fantastic. And that is an important thing to consider, is sometimes people will adhere, and it's like, oh, you got me. Life or death? Different situation. And that's much more what they had in mind. Not that the Western sources didn't have that, but there was an understanding, if you will. This is before the Great War, when war was still considered to be a romantic or gentlemanly pastime. Very different culture, very different approach, and just very different way of thinking that we can, but also can't wrap our heads around. That's the important thing to remember when reading historical words, even if they're from the same culture you are. It was a different time, and people had different approaches. But either way. Here we go. The cuts most in favor with Japanese swordsmen are mainly of the chopping order, and mostly delivered at the head and right wrist. Some few, however, pay particular attention to their adversary's stomach, and, if skillful swordsmen, these are the most difficult to tackle. Now, what he's specifically talking about there is kind of the main 3 attacks, at least, that still seem to be like the main hits in Kendo that I've seen. It's going to be straight up cut to the head, and by chop, he's not really talking about like brutish chop. He's talking about quick cuts like that. Down, up, things along those lines, or boom. Now, those same targets are pretty much the same ones we hit in HEMA, minus the dough. That's a little rare, but it actually still exists. I'll get back to that in a second. So, head, of course, obvious target. Right wrist is going to be, they're standing out in usually Chudan. That's always the target. Or if you're even up, left wrist is now the lead wrist, from what I gathered by reading some Kendo stuff. So it's going to be your main targets. Now, some people, he said, favor hitting the belly, and basically what I've seen from watching some Kendo practitioners is there's like this subset of guys who are really good at it. And what they'll do is they'll come in to drive the opponent upward, either to defend his wrist or defend his head, and then whip through with a hard cut to the dough as they step offline. And there are some HEMA fighters that do the exact same thing. I don't know if he still does it, but I watched a tournament once that my guys were competing in, and Jason Behrens of the Denver Historical Fencing Academy was doing basically this exact same thing all throughout pools. I don't know if he still does it, like I said. It may have just been one of those things he was doing that day, but exactly that kind of description. And I was like, oh, okay, that's cool. I even myself cut to the belly very often. I don't do it the way with a long edge. I usually do it with a short edge, but it's still there. And if you can get good at it, driving someone high, whip through, it's great. So definitely I can see what he's talking about there. Okay. And he gives a general description of how to cut. The wrist cut is, so attacking the head is basically just straight in. Wrist cut is usually, according to him, is made with a disengaged cut over the opponent's sword. So basically what you're doing is you're long edge on long edge, you go over, down. Basically a little opnamen, same as everybody in HEMA does. So you should all be pretty familiar with that one. Mm-hmm. And if necessary, a sharp tap against the sword to throw. So boom, pop, boom. Basically what he's describing. As my wrist cracks. Anyway. Both of these cuts can be parried with a slight raising of the shinai and an outward twist of the wrist. And from both parries, return cuts can be made at either the head or wrist. So what he's talking about there is if they cut from my head, I raise up and put the strong in between me and the cut. If he goes for my wrist, I turn it over, turn the long edge. Very important skill. I have a whole video talking about this. But seriously, turn your long edge. Don't try to parry with your false edge. Though I've also seen beats with the side to deal with things, but that's definitely the safer one. Then he goes on to talk about how they stand generally closer to each other and fight in very close range, and that, on the contrary, some are very fond of keeping well away, and if not followed up and brought into close quarters, will resort to a wildly different mode of attack, consisting mainly of slashing cuts, first with one hand and then with the other, the exchanges being carried out with wonderful rapidity. Now, I don't actually know what he's specifically referencing here. I have theories. I tried looking up modern Kendo rules for one-handed strikes, and it seems they are still allowed in some contexts. I got a little bit of conflicting information on that. I also tried looking up some Kenjutsu instances, but the majority of those were just on the draw, so that wasn't very helpful. But I have seen images / reference to that a lot, where you strike out with only your left hand on the blade, and of course you can do the same thing this way. But this one gets you more reach. So, as near as I can tell, what you'll see is people who stay at distance, they'll whip those cuts out, and then at that point they'll keep it kind of out and rotate it around the wrist for cut, they can return it, they can switch hands. And you think he's probably meaning along the lines of your two-handed cutting at distance, or then you release with the one hand, your left hand, for the majority of reach. And that's actually something that's made it into my repertoire. I used to disparage it, but then I learned its usefulness and practiced it, so my left hand could now guard while holding the sword at the very end, and that is a very important skill to learn. Be it this hand got disabled, or you slipped, or you went for a thrust, which is another one I've seen, has been they execute a thrust in that same sort of way. But either way, that's, I think, what he's describing, but I have no idea. If you know, please tell me. I'm super curious. But either way. The principal swinging cut can be delivered for either side of the opponent's head, but if he is a good swordsman, it is a somewhat risky one to resort to, for he can reply to it either with a stop thrust or a stop cut at the head. So, referencing the idea of stop thrusts and stop cuts, which are things that don't really get talked about a whole lot because most people just end up afterblowing afterwards. But a stop thrust or stop cut is something that is designed to halt someone's motion. So, for example, in the preparation time of you pulling back, boom, I hit. Or alternatively, a cut is coming through, boom, I thrust and I try to catch your sword if I can, or lock out your arm. It's not particularly easy to do, and really it's one of those I think suffers from the fact that we can't just kill each other, because not that every one of these is going to drop someone instantly, but if you could ragdoll them, that certainly makes it safer. Alternatively, if you can ram your sword deep enough through them, you can literally body check them and prevent their cut from continuing, which is another thing to consider. Or just chop their hand off, as messer fencers are wont to do. There is only one form of hanging guard known to the Japanese swordsman, and it is seldom resorted to, for it makes a smart return a matter of great difficulty. So what I believe he's referencing there is here, essentially. And I've seen this in Kendo, I've seen it in Kenjutsu as well. And yeah, I would definitely agree, because trying to cut out of here requires you to turn, then extend. And, I mean, you can launch cuts from here, but they're not as great, and they're limited on range, so it's one that you will occasionally resort to, but if you're there, you're kind of in a disadvantage. And the same is true in longsword, though, of course, we can execute thrusts versus they won't execute their thrusts, which is a big part of that. But it's more of a hanging guard as opposed to an ox is the thing to be aware of. So, not surprising that it's not resorted to often, and if it is there, it's probably something that most people see that as, you've made the bad parry, here's an opportunity. Same way I see other certain blocks. And then he generally compares the idea of Japanese warriors needing to fight on foot more often than knights did. Country by country, that's debatable. But either way, it's not a bad comparison, as using a sword on horseback, you can use a much heavier, longer sword without difficulty. If you try to use that same sword on foot, it's gonna suck. It's gonna suck quite a lot. But that is a thing to consider, versus while the tachi is longer, and I think a little heavier, it's not that different, and I don't know if anyone would be carrying tachis, or, I mean, he probably saw tachis and things like that, but he may not have heard a difference between them very often. He may not have cared. They may not have cared. I don't know, in regards to, at this period, what the difference would be considered at that point. So that is something to consider. But either way, a tachi is not that much heavier or bigger compared to a katana. It is there, but it's not that different. You could fight on foot with it easily. Versus, and especially compared to European weapons, there's a drastic difference between something that's good for foot combat versus good on horseback, especially in the time of the 1880s, when cavalry and infantry are two very separate roles. But anyway. And then he goes into generally talking about a little bit of history of Western swords and how we evolved out of cutting at each other to favoring the point more and thus becoming more linear, etc. And things along those lines. But then he caps it off with a very interesting quote, and I really like this quote, and I wanted to talk about it. Basically, it's the whole reason I made this video, which is, now, the katana can be used as well on rough and on smooth and level ground. But though a wonderfully effective weapon, it is by no means a perfect one. Nor is katana play alone, pure and simple. A perfect weapon is perfect style of swordsmanship. Such can only be arrived at by making a new style of sword and instituting a new style of sword play, combining them all that is best in the swords of the West and the swords of the Far East and in the methods employed in their use. That's a key bit. And the reason that that's so important is because he makes, one, differentiation between just, we need a new style of swordplay. He says we need a new style of sword. And that's really important because anyone will know, sure, I could do Bolognese swordsmanship with my basket hilt. Would it work? Yeah. Is it ideal? No, right? I could do Bolognese style swordsmanship with my messer. Would it work? Yes. Is it ideal? Definitely not. And the further and further removed I go, the more difficult that becomes. Could I do Western style swordsmanship with a katana? Yes. Would it be ideal? No. It's just not gonna function. The benefits of the katana lead into the benefits of Kenjutsu. The benefits of the military saber lead into the benefits of the military saber system. That's why they are what they are. If you wanted to make the perfect system, you really do need to sit down and borrow just the best from everything. It'd be the same as, not that I'm saying MMA is a perfect system, mind you, but it'd be the same kind of idea, an amalgamation of fighting arts of various different things. And the new sword to go with it would really be the key part of it, because you're gonna have to make sacrifices. I mean, what would this new sword look like? And by all means, post your ideas in the comments below if anyone comments on these videos. Would you want a longer handle? Would you want to be one-handed or two-handed? Would you want it to be something that, because take in mind, people like to say, oh, I'll make it just long enough a grip I can put two hands on it, but it's mostly a one-handed sword. Okay, that's going to make the blade shorter. Because if you want to use it one-handed, you don't want too long or heavy of a blade. Or it's like, okay, I want two hands on it, but I want to occasionally be able to use it one-handed. Okay, you're not going to be able to use it one-handed as much as you want unless you make the blade shorter. Do I want to be able to thrust? Do I want to thrust well, or do I want to just be able to thrust? Do I want one edge or two? Various different things. Do I want a cross piece? Do I not want a cross piece? Should I have a slight basket? There's a bunch of stuff you can talk about. And once you've got that designed, then you need to look at the techniques and say, okay, what works with this sword, what doesn't? And more often than not, you're probably going to come up with a great sword design. You're going to come up with some moves that work for it, and then you're going to be like, this is too limiting. This doesn't work. We need to do it again. And it would probably just go round and round and round in circles, because diversity really is a good thing in regards to weapons. You need different things for different jobs, for different wars. Just because the style of one swordsmanship worked well in one conflict may not mean it works well in another. Like, for example, the British talking about how favoring the thrust against the Sikh and the Afghans, two cultures that did not thrust at each other very often, was a big advantage. It didn't win the war or anything like that, but it was a big advantage, or things along those lines. And the fact is, we'll never know, because we invented the machine gun, but it is still fun to speculate about if you were to try and make this ultimate style of swordsmanship as he is talking about here. And he doesn't try to do that, I should also point out. He just mentions you need to really make something perfect. And I think he also saw the fallacy in the idea of making something perfect, because nothing's perfect. But either way, some of the best points about Kenjutsu are that from every guard or parry, some 2 or more different returns can be made, and that such guards or parries are more of a fending off order than strictly stopping ones, thus allowing for the returns to be made more quickly and the guards with less exertion. Again, neither strength nor length of reach are of such great advantage in Kenjutsu, as they are in Western systems of swordplay, and so men of varying sizes and degrees of strength are brought on footings of greater equality when practicing it than they would be with us. Now, what he's talking about there is also the idea of just, how do I put this? It's in regards to the parries and fending off, especially when it comes to doing military exercise. A lot of the parries feel very rigid, and I was actually just discussing this with some of my backsword students. It's like one of them asked, "You're doing your parries differently. What is it you do?" Because I try to make my parries a little more lively, and this isn't necessarily something that is my invention. It's just I learned to parry from a different system. And at first, I was doing things very rigid. Hard St. George, hard outside half hanger, hard inside line, all that stuff. But over time, as I became more comfortable with it, in comes the cut. It starts to slip into it a little more, right? Not block, return. It becomes block out, or things along those lines, especially my inside half hanger. Rather than block, solid, it became roll and things of that. And there's a slight percussiveness to it that I can't really explain by video. You've got to feel it from me doing it to you or someone else doing it to you. And certainly not everyone's going to pick that up. They may eventually learn of their own, or they may have someone teach it to them, but it's never explicitly said as far as I know. And as such, it can be very rigid at times, like hard block, trying to return, or things along those lines, as opposed to that more fluidity that you get when you fight a different style. Like, I don't do hard parries in Messer or Rapier or anything along those lines, or we'll do them in longsword sometimes, but that's more for grabbing actions. It's going to be that idea of when I parry, I have like several options. I have 4 options usually off most parries, and that leads you to having a lot more to do. Not calling Western's military saber simple. It's not. It's a simple game to learn with easily understandable rules. And it's about learning how to break those rules as much as possible while still being effective, because the rules are there for a reason. But, there are various little things you can do to add to your style of it. It is a blank slate that you can then imprint yourself upon. Like, for example, one of my buddies, the same one who got me onto having more interest in Japan, he is a boxer originally, and as such advances when he guards. And he's been having trouble in backsword with that. I encourage it. I mean, don't get me wrong, there are sometimes you don't want to do it, but if that's something that's ingrained and you're also a big boy like him, sure, in comes the cut, catch it as you move forward, move into grappling, or heck, turn into closing actions, or maybe even start doing it. You can do a myriad of things. There's a bunch of options, but it's something that you can take, which isn't necessarily explicitly encouraged or discouraged by the text itself, that is. Your teacher will be different depending upon their personal preference, their approach, what they think works, blah, 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 right? Even I'm super biased. And even I'm not above. I am super biased. But you take the text. Does it say you shouldn't move forward when you parry? No. Sometimes it does, but that's specific instances. We're going to omit those. So if I know I do it, I might as well just make something out of that. If I'm going to do it, I might as well make something out of it, right? Same thing if you were to retreat. Same thing if you had more percussive parries like I do. Doesn't matter. Take it, work with it. And as long as it's working, nothing wrong with it. And that's kind of what he's talking about here, is that you have so many more options based upon these positions you'll move into, that you can end up with more complex exchanges that are at times less appealing to watch. A nice back and forth looks great. A true fight, longsword, katana, what have you, if you know what's going on, you can follow it pretty well, but it's much less obvious, I would say, and sometimes much less pretty, unless you get like that perfect timing. But anyway, I digress. And then again, while just as scientific as our systems of swordplay, the Japanese system is much less artificial one. And so, with the majority of men, less time would be required for picking up a knowledge of it. I do kind of agree with him here. Now, by artificial, what he's really saying is that, especially if you're brought into a military culture, there is a hard and fast, this is the way we do it. And you adapt to that. Now, it's not always the case, but certainly back then, your teacher would probably have, still today, right? Your teacher's ego or your teacher's approach is going to matter a lot. And when they literally hold rank over you, that can definitely matter. And I wonder if perhaps FJ is talking a little bit about some maybe personal grudge he used to have. But anyway, in regards to artificial, It's that the exercises you go through are idealized, right? It's not necessarily, I mean, you could say kata is idealized as well, but it's also not. It's infantry exercise is like, okay, I do this now. I do this now. And you are learning things from it. Like Angelo's lessons, for example. That's not the be all end all of swordplay. It's here is some concepts. Like when I teach it to my guys, I teach them, what did you learn? I learned to guard my head. I learned to cut at you. I learned to guard my head. And I learned I can cut for the leg. But what do you got to do? I got to guard my head after I do that. Bingo, right? I just want you to learn those concepts. And I think Angelo wanted the same thing and things of that nature. And so without that approach, or maybe even with it sometimes, it can be difficult for a student to grasp the sheer amount of options you will eventually have with a sword. Versus when you have more options just on the table, it's not rigid, it's not regimented. It may very well be easier for people to pick up. I have always found that people take to the longsword pretty easily. Not necessarily to its fullest extent, but they will have a working playbook within about a year, I would say. And, compared to, yes, I can teach you the basics of how to fight with a backsword in probably only about 4 weeks. Your ability to go beyond that will not be the same. But that's personal speculation / his personal opinion. You should form your own, dependent upon what you see, dependent upon who you're working with, dependent upon what culture you work with. It's all different. Everybody's different is really the long and short of it. But then he goes on to talk about the idea of just famous smiths, and I won't get into that because that's not really the purpose of this. And then he goes over some interesting mottos that have been engraved. Probably my favorite of which, and by engraved I mean engraved upon famous swords, probably my favorite of which being, there's not twixt heaven and earth that a man need fear who carries this in his belt, this single blade. That's pretty cool. He then goes on to just talk about Japanese wrestling. Has a fantastic breakdown of sumo. I would get into that, but that's not really my forte. I do really love sumo though, and it's just fantastic for him to talk about that detail. According to my good buddy who knows a lot more about sumo than me, it's one of the best guides to sumo that he's ever seen. But anyway, though, like I said, this wasn't a norm. This wasn't the standard video, but I still think it's a really worthwhile topic, and maybe you won't get as much out of it as I think I have, or maybe you won't get as much out of it on first hearing as you will when you read it for yourself and form your own opinions. Because that's the great thing about this. We get to be super opinionated, and there is no right or wrong, necessarily. There's just whoever's left, I guess. But either way, I wanted to talk about that because it's applicable to a modern mind very much. It's also applicable to where you may eventually be, where you may be now as a modern fencer, which is an appreciation for other styles and to not hawk it till you try it, basically. As well as don't necessarily forget where you came from or where it came from. I have no doubt that if he had to do cavalry service again, he would just go back to what he was taught before, because that's what worked. That's what he used in the service. You're always going to fall back on your whatever is your core in the situation that it warrants. Things along those lines. Now, last couple details I want to talk about is there is a nice PDF that a guy did on his life, categorizing as much as he could. FJ would actually serve in the Great War. He reenlisted at like age 60, which is crazy. But he was a victim of a gas attack, did not die, but was discharged due to it, and as such then died in, I believe, 1926. And if you'd like to read more about his life, I'll link the PDF down below. I have not finished reading it myself because I wanted to just sit down and make this video. But either way, later after coming back to the UK and establishing basically the first Kendo school, he did an exhibition bout with a friend of his where it was single stick versus Kenjutsu. So he was in theory using a shinai. And there's some newspaper clippings that talk about it. And from all accounts, he had the slight better of it, though there was speculation, of course, because he knew single stick before. And single stick in this case was probably meant they were using a single stick, but gentleman was most likely using just military saber, moving around, not actual single stick rules, though I can't confirm that. They say that FJ had the better of it, but it was possibly due to him having a knowledge of single stick versus if you had someone who had no idea how to fight with a single stick, etc. That would be a different contest, and that is true. It's one of the reasons that I really want to find a pure Tulwar fighter or a pure Dao fighter to test my backstory against, because that makes a difference. Versus if they know a little bit about it, they can exploit it, and I want to see them learn on the job, just like I have to learn on the job. But in the age of the internet, that's a little less avoidable. But either way, so that's kind of the last interesting anecdote I have from him. Seems like a super interesting guy. Seems like he lived a heck of a life, and I really appreciate his book. I think it's worth a read, both as a modern fencer and as just someone who appreciates firsthand accounts. And hopefully you have gotten a decent amount out of these two videos. So either way, sorry for the departure in the norm. I'll be making up for it next week when I record my usual series. But either way, thank you very much for watching, and we'll talk about some other stuff another time.